Hello and welcome to the AIDEM Risala Update interactions once again. Today we are discussing an earth-shaking political event that has happened in our neighboring country, Sri Lanka, where a leftist Marxist organization, Janata Vimukti Peramana or JVP as it's normally called, it has come to power beating the traditional legacy political parties of Sri Lanka. And of course, this has happened after a crippling economic crisis that had kind of engulfed Sri Lanka over the last few years. And to discuss this situation in these interactions, I have with me Amita Arudpragasam, an independent policy analyst based in Sri Lanka. She's a product of the Princeton University and she has specialized understanding of governance issues where she studied at Harvard. Amita, welcome to these interactions. Let me start by, please.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah. Let me straight away get to this question because, it has been, this election result has been variously described as historic, path-breaking, and in some politicians and political observers across the world have also called it a political tsunami. And of course, in the run-up to the elections, I have read your article in Foreign Policy, where you have written that economy has taken center stage and this is going to be decisive for this election. But even then, many observers of Sri Lankan politics said that leftists have come to the center stage of the electoral battle, but that's not good enough to let them win the election. So can you just explain to our viewers as to what are the factors which ultimately led to this result?
Well, first of all, I'd like to put in context these words of political tsunami, that this is an earth-shattering event and so on. If we look at our last presidential election that was held in 2019, the winning candidate actually secured many more votes than the current candidate has secured. So in 2019, there were, again, about 35 candidates, and the leading candidate won with 6.9 million votes, or 52.25% of
the total votes.
Exactly. Currently, in this 2024 presidential poll, we've seen Anura Kumara Dissanayake, the winning candidate, emerge with 5.6 million votes and only 42.31% of votes in the first count. So this election is also unique for Sri Lanka because it's the first time we've had a second count. So we've counted the first set of votes, and because no candidate was able to secure a majority of those votes, plus one vote, so 50% plus one, we moved to a second round of counting of preferences. And so I would actually refrain from characterizing this election as a political tsunami or earth-shattering, because if we contextualize it using the numbers, it's actually less of a landslide than not just the last election, but most presidential polls before that. So the candidate has won. He has secured a majority, well, not a majority in the first count. He has performed better than the other candidates, of course, but it wasn't a landslide or a win like that.
But why is it then being characterized as a landslide? Because the JVP was in any case a fringe party. In the last elections, they got only 3%. I mean, you're talking about 42%. From 3% to 42% is a huge quantum leap kind of a situation. One needs to accept that. Can you just tell us how JVP? Because if you look at the origins of the JVP, it is something like the Naxalbari left extremist movement that we had in India. They waged 2 wars against the Sri Lankan government in their early years of inception, and then in recent years they moved back to the mainstream politics. And but even then, from 3% to 42%, how did this quantum leap happen? And what are the mechanisms, political mechanisms, that the JVP used to kind of garner this kind of popular support?
So I think you're right in identifying this leap in terms of the JVP, NPP's popularity as what is taking people by shock and by surprise. The JVP is now part of a wider coalition that was formed in 2019 called the NPP, which also contains, student youth groups, women's groups, youth groups as well, and also academics. So it's part of a wider coalition, and it hasn't, neither of these groups, the JVP nor the NPP, have actually ever been able to win a presidential election or secure more than a certain percentage within parliament. So for this particular group, for the JVP in particular, it's a very significant shift in their popularity as represented in the polls. I think one thing that contributes to this is really the correct attribution of many of the causes of the economic crisis to misgovernance by the Rajapaksa regime that has been in power for a very significant time in this country. And since prior to the end of the civil war, the Rajapaksas have had significant positions in government.
Practically the primary political family of the country.
Yes, one of the two major political families of political dynasties or groups in the country. And because of the attribution of the economic crisis to this regime, we have seen their popularity being decimated, really. Then you have a huge block of voters who are now trying to determine who will actually be the right fit for them in terms of improving livelihoods, improving living conditions, and ensuring that there's a prosperous country to return to. Sri Lanka, faced this huge economic crisis in 2021, 2022. We saw poverty levels doubling. We, have a huge percentage of our population now facing food insecurity, about 20%. And, Sri Lankans did not expect this kind of economic mismanagement, following which all of these political changes have happened. So I think Anura Kumara Dissanayake really rises to power, emerges as a leading candidate following this very critical economic crisis. And, as a candidate, compared to his two main competitors, he is the one who is considered outside of the political establishment. So following the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, we saw widespread protests that were larger than really we've seen in Colombo at any point of our history. And so Anura Kumara Dissanayake comes in as this candidate from outside the system and is really seen as the only person who is able to convincingly challenge the political establishment, change the political culture that has resulted in so much misgovernance and the economic crisis.
It has also been noted by many political observers and politicians that Anura Dissanayake had focused on corruption, and corruption was one of the major issues that kind of catapulted him to greater popularity. How do you look at that argument?
I mean, this is absolutely correct. Corruption, a change in political culture. We've had, actually corruption has been a significant election issue was in 2015 as well, during that presidential poll. And aside from corruption, you had the ethnic conflict also being historically a major campaigning point for candidates. And in the wake of the economic crisis, it's understandable that voters also want to see an end to the corruption in government. And this is exactly why Anura Kumara Dissanayake, who has positioned himself as somebody outside the traditional political establishment, is somebody who is seen as able to politically challenge, those who are in power, who have been accused of corruption. There's allegations of corruption on both sides of the political establishment. So in both of those traditional old political families.
In his first statements after becoming the president, he has promised a Sri Lankan renaissance. But he has not spelled out what are the details, whether what it means in terms of the economy, what it means in terms of society. Do you have any sense as to what he means by the Sri Lankan renaissance?
Well, I think really these words capture the sense of hope that the new president is bringing in with him. Like has been this character who has stood against corruption. He wants a change in political culture. Unfortunately, I think Mr. Dissanayake is going to be constrained by several factors. First, this was a presidential election, not a parliamentary election. So he still doesn't have the backing of parliamentarians. Secondly, Mr. Dissanayake, the country is still going through an economic crisis and will be going through, will need to put in place certain policies to keep the country economically stable, to help it grow and so on. And currently we're working within the paradigms of an IMF program. So Mr. Dissanayake is going to be economically constrained in terms of the policies that he can implement. He has said that he would like to continue with the IMF program, and he may make a few amendments, renegotiate certain parts of that package, but for a while he is going to try and stay within the paradigms of that package. Therefore, he is going to be constrained in a few ways. He's going to be constrained by what he can do economically, and he's going to be constrained also by parliamentarians until he can dissolve parliament and until he has the backing of parliamentarians. So although Mr. Dissanayake says he's going to bring about a Sri Lankan renaissance, I think a lot of that is this kind of very powerful political rhetoric that you saw within his campaign, which also characterized most of the demands that protesters had in the Aragale, or the people's struggle, which followed Sri Lanka's economic crisis. So, he is very much aligned with that kind of aspirational, we want a better culture, we want a shift. And I don't know, I'm cautious to say that is something, given the constraints, that he'll be able to achieve.
At the moment, it is more rhetoric than something that's based on concrete facts.
At the moment, yes, but where I suppose almost anybody who has been in Sri Lanka in the last few years and has seen the country being devastated by economic crisis would like to believe that
something is happening.
Something is happening, yeah.
When we were interacting before this, before we actually started this Zoom call, and you said there are some important developments that could be expected today. Do you have any sense as to what it could be? Could you give us an inkling of that?
So Mr. Dissanayake has, he has said that as soon as he is elected president, he is going to dissolve parliament, that we're going to have parliamentary elections announced. He has a cabinet of ministers that he is due to appoint as well. He has already started appointing secretaries to different ministries. Now, these developments are really important for analysts looking at what's happening at the country, because although the NPP has a manifesto, the manifesto indicates it's a social contract, obviously, between the public and elected representatives, and it indicates a policy direction of the government. But the manifesto of the NPP is quite lengthy, and it has many policies within the document in different areas, but they're not necessarily well prioritized. Showing, these appointments of cabinet ministers, appointments of secretaries to the ministries, really is a demonstration of which of the NPP's policy direction and how it's going to prioritize the many pledges and promises that it's put in its manifesto. So for me, really it's important not just to look at the JVP NPP's history. It's also important to look at its manifesto and the pledges it's made on the campaign trail. And then shortly after an election, it's very important to scrutinize the kinds of, appointments that are being made, the first decisions, the first speeches, the first words. All of these are really important in understanding how Mr. Dissanayake is going to act in his term as president.
Well, an international parallel to what has happened in Sri Lanka in the last week, I think, could be from Greece in 2004, when Syriza also rode on an anti-corruption plank and also kind of championed the economic crisis that Greece was going through. But finally, Syriza failed very miserably. I mean, so we have that experience in front of us. Very similar slogans, very similar patterns. But then when it came to finally the governance nitty-gritty, Syriza could not succeed. So that is also a kind of warning for Mr. Dissanayake, I suppose. And finally, the one last question that that perhaps most Indian politicians and Indian polity as a whole is worried about. Dissanayake is a very, very avowed Marxist, and his partisanship or predilection towards China is very clear, though he has made some gestures to India. He had visited India and spoken to the Indian leadership, including the foreign minister. So where is this tilt going to take Sri Lanka to? Is it going to be more pro-China, or are we going to see a kind of middle of the road?
So I think it's a great question that you're asking, because firstly, the international media has spoken a lot about Mr. Disanayake's Marxist background. Now, I would be very cautious again with attributing this kind of ideological label to Mr. Dissanayake. Firstly, because the JVP, which is his party, is now part of a broader coalition that was only formed in 2019. The JVP is a party with Marxist-Leninist origins, and the JVP has also gone through multiple transformations and has really, departed in several ways from its origins in terms of policy. So, the policies in the NPP's policy document, in its manifesto, are really do not align with what you might expect from a Marxist-Leninist party, right? So, for example, even the fact that Mr. Dissanayake has said he will work with the IMF, which is considered a neoliberal institution. The fact that, for example, he has said he wants to have export-oriented trade. He wants to increase market efficiency and competition. He wants to decrease taxes as well, indirect and direct taxes. Now, a lot of these policies are very much at odds with the kind of isolationist, import substitution, and protectionist policies that may characterize or have characterized some more left parties in Sri Lanka, right? So first of all, I think it's important to be cautious about the ideological labels we're attributing to Mr. Dissanayake, whose party hasn't been voted in. He as a person is now the president. So we have to be cautious about that. Secondly, with regards to India-China, it's not really clear to us at this juncture how Mr. Dissanayake will proceed in terms of his foreign policy. What we do know is that following the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, China has also played a very minimal role in terms of the discourse shaping Sri Lanka. And this may be because China wants to take a step back, not be associated. It received a lot of bad press for some of the large-scale infrastructure projects that it facilitated the previous regime to construct. And so, China has taken a bit of a back step. India, on the other hand, has been very hands-on and very has played a huge role during the economic crisis in bailing out Sri Lanka in several ways. I think that has gone a long way towards reshaping public opinion of these two countries and our relationship to these two countries. So how Mr. Dissanayake acts in the coming days, it's really important to be objective, and it's really important to kind of see how he acts going forward. The Adani wind project, for example, is a project that received a lot of criticism in the last few years. And it's, an Indian project. Mr. Dissanayake has said that he was going to renegotiate, or, he was not in favor of this project. And I know that has created a lot of concern in India that, investments with India will be renegotiated and so on. But really, if a political actor in Sri Lanka is able to look at any investment, whether from India or Sri Lanka or China or Japan, and look at it objectively, transparently, talk through and with the public, communicate the pros and cons of this deal, and come up with a really good, solid project for Sri Lankans that improves the national interests of all Sri Lankans, then I think both India and China will understand how to deal with Sri Lanka better, will be less concerned about projects being, that Sri Lankans choose to invest in. And so it's important for individuals to look at at projects and whether they serve the interests of Sri Lankans. If the Adani project is not something that's in the best interest of Sri Lankans, if it wasn't bidded on competitively, if it has environmental concerns associated with it, if it is in the route of migratory birds or what have you, then I think it's fair for Sri Lankans to renegotiate or rethink through some of these investments.
Absolutely. Thank you for that perspective, Amita. I would just like to add one thing. There is an interesting observation that is doing the rounds in Indian left circles, that the big changes that we've seen in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in the last few months have an Adani connection. There is an Adani project which has been criticized by the people of Bangladesh, and that is also one of the factors, which kind of triggered the entire unrest in that country. And similarly, you have this Adani project in Sri Lanka, which has of course not exactly be the main reason, but one of the main factors in the change of the political landscape. Thank you very much for giving us the time, and I'm sure that we will have more occasion to interact, and we will continue this conversation. And your points on the on kind of defining Dissanayake as a Marxist-Leninist is also very important. But I would like to add here that even Chinese Marxism-Leninism is no longer the classical Marxism-Leninism. You have the principles of Deng and Chiang Zemin kind of which is dominating the Chinese economic policy. So I think we need to kind of calibrate and move very carefully while we are giving these classifications. But thank you very much for giving this perspective. It was really wonderful having you with us.
Thank you for having me here.